The crisp autumn morning carried a sense of anticipation through the small town of Millbrook. Outside the red brick city hall, fallen leaves danced across the steps as news vans and photographers gathered for what would become a historic moment. Inside, in a modest office overlooking Main Street, Officer Alice Wong straightened her badge one last time before the ceremony that would change her life and the future of their community. For 20 years, she had worked her way up through the ranks, starting as a rookie patrol officer walking the night beat. Back then, some of her colleagues had mockingly called her meter maid, despite her graduating top of her class at the police academy. But Wong had learned early on to let her work speak for itself. She remembered clearly the turning point in her career, the night she single-handedly talked down an armed suspect at the local diner, saving 12 hostages without firing a single shot. That incident had earned her not just a commendation, but the respect of even her harshest critics. Year after year, she built her reputation on a foundation of integrity, fairness, and an uncanny ability to see the human side of every situation. The town council's decision to appoint her as police chief hadn't come easily. The debate had lasted 6 hours, with passionate arguments from both supporters and opponents. But in the end, her track record was undeniable. Crime rates had consistently dropped in every district she supervised. Community engagement had soared. Young officers sought her out as a mentor, and even the old-timers couldn't deny her tactical expertise. As she waited for the ceremony to begin, Wong's thoughts drifted to her father, who had moved to America with nothing but $20 and a dream of giving his children a better life. He had worked double shifts at his small grocery store, teaching her that respect was earned through hard work and treating everyone with dignity. Every person who walks through that door, he used to say, has a story worth hearing. The council chamber was packed when she entered. Familiar faces filled the rows, fellow officers, community leaders, and residents she'd helped over the years. In the front row sat Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman whose cat Wong had rescued from a tree during her first week on patrol. Behind her was the Thompson family, whose teenage son she'd mentored after catching him spray painting the community center. Instead of arresting him, she had channeled his artistic talents into creating a beautiful mural that still brightened the building's walls. As the mayor administered the oath of office, Wong's voice remained steady, but her heart swelled with purpose. This wasn't just about making history as the first Asian American woman to lead the department. This was about bringing positive change to the community that had shaped her entire career. The weight of the new badge felt different on her uniform. Heavier with responsibility, yet somehow right. As she took the podium to give her acceptance speech, she caught sight of a group of young female officers standing together near the back of the room. Their proud smiles reminded her of herself 20 years ago, full of hope and determination to make a difference. What Wong couldn't know, was that her first day as chief would test every principle she stood for, every lesson she'd learned, and every ounce of courage she possessed. The morning celebration would soon give way to challenges that would either define her leadership or break it entirely. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel the full magnitude of what her appointment meant, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Looking out at the sea of faces before her, she began her speech with the same words her father had taught her so many years ago. Every person has a story worth hearing, and today we begin a new chapter together. A new chapter indeed, one that would shake the foundations of the Millbrook Police Department in ways no one could have predicted. The excitement of the swearing-in ceremony faded quickly as Chief Wong settled into her new office the next morning. The room still held traces of its previous occupant, a lingering smell of old coffee and manila folders stacked in messy piles. As she began organizing her desk, a worn leather folder caught her eye, tucked behind a filing cabinet as if someone had tried to hide it. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, she found what looked like routine police reports, but something felt off. Reading further, her heart sank. These weren't just regular reports. They were detailed instructions for targeting specific neighborhoods, all of them home to minority communities. Traffic stop quotas, random searches, and surveillance operations were all carefully planned to focus on these areas. This can't be right, she whispered to herself, checking the dates. The most recent document was dated just last week. More disturbing were the handwritten notes in the margins. Keep pressure on Zone 4 and focus on Oak Street after school hours. She recognized the handwriting of several senior officers. As she dug deeper, more documents emerged. Excel sheets showed how officers who made more stops in these neighborhoods received better assignments and overtime opportunities. Those who questioned these practices found themselves stuck on desk duty or working the least desirable shifts. Her office phone rang, startling her. It was the front desk, reminding her about the morning staff meeting scheduled in 10 minutes. Perfect timing. She now had something very specific to discuss. Walking into the conference room, Wong felt every eye on her. 20 officers sat around the long table, some she'd known for years, others barely familiar. Lieutenant Richards, a 30-year veteran, was in the middle of telling a joke, but his laughter died as she placed the leather folder on the table. Before we discuss regular business, Wong began, her voice calm but firm. I'd like to talk about some interesting documents I found this morning. She pulled out the first memo and laid it on the table. Would anyone like to explain why we have unofficial policies targeting specific neighborhoods? The silence was deafening. Officer Thompson, one of the younger cops, looked at his shoes. Lieutenant Richards cleared his throat. Chief, those are just standard operating procedures. They've been in place for years. They work. Work for whom? Wong asked, pulling out more papers. Because according to these numbers, we're eroding community trust and making people feel like criminals in their own neighborhoods. Another senior officer, Captain Lee, leaned forward. Look, you're new to this position. There are certain realities of police work that require specific approaches. His tone carried a hint of condescension that made several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Wong walked around the table slowly, making eye contact with each person. Let me be very clear, she said. These practices end today. We're here to protect and serve everyone equally. Our job is to build trust, not destroy it. And if we disagree, Captain Lee challenged, his face reddening. Then you're welcome to submit your resignation, Wong replied calmly. Because while I'm chief, we will not have two sets of rules for different parts of town. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged worried glances. A few sat stone-faced, their displeasure evident. As the meeting continued, Wong outlined her plans for immediate changes. Equal patrol distributions. Body cameras activated at all times. Monthly community feedback sessions. With each point, she could see the room dividing. Those ready for change and those resistant to it. Later that afternoon, while getting coffee in the break room, she overheard two officers whispering. She won't last 6 months, one said. The union will shut her down. Wong smiled to herself, stirring her coffee. They didn't know her very well if they thought she'd back down from a fight. After all, she hadn't spent 20 years working twice as hard as everyone else to maintain the status quo. By day's end, news of the morning's confrontation had spread through the department like wildfire. 3 complaint forms had already been filed against her, and someone had keyed her car in the parking lot. But as she gathered her things to leave, a young officer knocked on her door. Chief, he said quietly, I just wanted you to know, some of us are glad you found those files. It's time things changed around here. Wong nodded, knowing this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she had taken the first step. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start a revolution. The next morning arrived with a chill in the air and tension in the station. Chief Wong had called for an all-hands meeting at 9 a.m. sharp. As officers filed into the department's largest conference room, The usual morning chatter was replaced by nervous whispers and uncertain glances. She stood at the front of the room, her posture straight but not stiff, watching as every chair filled up. The room was cramped with nearly 60 officers present. Patrol officers, detectives, and senior staff all squeezed in together. Some stood along the walls, arms crossed, while others sat forward in their chairs, curious about what would come next. Yesterday, Wang began, her voice clear and steady. We discussed some troubling discoveries. Today, we're going to talk about solutions. She clicked a remote, and the projection screen lit up with statistics. These numbers tell a story, and it's not a story I'm proud of. The graphs showed arrest rates, traffic stops, and use of force incidents, all broken down by neighborhood. The disparity was impossible to ignore. Captain Lee, who had been so vocal yesterday, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Chief," he interrupted, raising his hand but speaking before being acknowledged. "These numbers don't tell the whole story. Crime rates are higher in those areas. We're just following the data." Wang clicked to the next slide. "Interesting you should mention that." New charts appeared, showing that while police presence and stops were dramatically higher in certain neighborhoods, actual crime rates didn't justify the disparity. We've been creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. More officers looking for trouble in one area will naturally find more low-level offenses. A younger detective raised her hand. "But what about our clearance rates? They're among the highest in the state." "At what cost?" Wang countered, walking closer to the group. "I spoke with store owners on Oak Street yesterday. Did you know most won't call us anymore, even when they need help? They've lost faith in us. That's not protection. That's not service." She pulled out a letter from her pocket. "This morning, I received this from Mrs. Thompson in the Pine Grove neighborhood. Her son, a straight-A student, was stopped and searched 3 times last month walking home from band practice. 3 times. Tell me, how does that make our community safer?" The room fell silent. Even the usual skeptics seemed to be listening now. "Starting today," Wang continued, "we're implementing changes. First, all patrol routes are being redrawn. Every neighborhood gets equal coverage. Second, we're starting mandatory community engagement hours. Each officer will spend time at community centers, schools, and local businesses, not as law enforcement, but as neighbors." A veteran officer stood up, his face red. "This is garbage. You're making our jobs impossible. We can't protect people if we're busy playing community helper." Wang met his gaze calmly. "Officer, what's your most memorable arrest?" Taken aback by the question, he hesitated. "Caught a burglar breaking into the hardware store last year. Had been hitting places all month." "And how did you catch him?" He shifted his weight. "Got a tip from the owner of the coffee shop next door. She recognized him from security footage I'd shown her earlier that week." "Exactly," Wang said, allowing a small smile. "Community trust solved that crime, not aggressive patrolling. When people trust us, they help us. When they fear us, they hide from us." She clicked the final slide, showing a new department organization chart. "I'm also creating a community relations unit. Any officer who wants to transfer in can apply. We'll be working directly with neighborhood leaders to rebuild trust." The room buzzed with mixed reactions. Some officers were nodding thoughtfully, while others looked ready to explode. "One more thing," Wang added, her tone becoming firmer. "These changes aren't optional. I expect full compliance from everyone who wants to remain on this force. Those who can't adapt are free to seek employment elsewhere." Just then, there was a knock at the door. The desk surgeon entered, looking worried. "Chief, the police union representatives are here. They're demanding to speak with you immediately." Wang checked her watch and nodded. "Right on schedule." She turned back to the room. "Meeting dismissed. Remember, change starts today, with each of us making different choices." As officers filed out, she noticed small groups forming, some angry, some thoughtful, some determined. A few lingered behind, waiting to speak with her privately. The battle lines were being drawn, but for the first time in years, they weren't being drawn through neighborhoods. Instead, they were forming between those who clung to the old ways and those ready to build something better. The backlash hit harder than expected. Chief Wong arrived at work to find her office door plastered with anonymous complaint forms. Inside, her inbox was flooded with emails from angry officers, each more hostile than the last. Someone had even taped a newspaper clipping from the 1950s to her computer screen. A story about a failed police chief who'd been forced to resign. She was reaching for her coffee mug when she noticed something wasn't right. Tiny pieces of glass sparkled at the bottom. A quick inspection revealed that someone had crushed a light bulb into her coffee grounds. Her hand trembled slightly as she dumped the contents into the trash. "Chief?" Her assistant poked her head in. "The union meeting is starting in 5 minutes, and you might want to see this first." She handed over a tablet showing the local news website. The headline made Wong's stomach drop. "Police Department in Chaos. Officers threaten mass resignation." The union meeting was held in a stuffy room downtown. As Wong walked in, 30 pairs of hostile eyes tracked her movement. The union president, Officer Bradford, a man who'd been passed over for chief 3 times, stood at the podium with a thick stack of papers. "We have here," he announced, waving the papers, signed statements from 48 officers expressing no confidence in the new chief's leadership. That's more than 2/3 of the force. Wong remained standing, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And I have here." She pulled out her own folder, 27 formal complaints from citizens about discriminatory treatment in the past month alone. "Which stack of papers should concern us more?" "You're destroying department morale," someone shouted from the back. "Morale?" Wong turned to face the voice. "Let's talk about morale. Last week, I spoke with Officer Chen. He told me about stopping a grandmother walking home from church because she matched a suspicious person description. He hasn't slept well since. That's what destroys morale, asking good officers to carry out bad policies." The room erupted in angry mutters. Bradford raised his hand for silence. "We're prepared to take this to the city council. Either the new policies go, or we do." Wong looked around the room slowly, making eye contact with each person. "Before you vote, let me share something with you. Yesterday, I received this." She pulled out her phone and played a voicemail on speaker. A trembling voice filled the room. "Chief, I'm calling because yesterday one of your officers helped my son. He was having a mental health crisis, and instead of arresting him like before, the officer got him help. He took time to listen. My boy's alive because of that. I never thought I'd trust the police again, but thank you." The room fell silent. Wong continued softly. "That officer was following our new engagement protocols. That's what real police work looks like." "It's not always that simple," Bradford countered, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You're right," Wong agreed. "It's not simple. Change is hard. But let me be clear, I'm not backing down. If you want to vote no confidence, go ahead. If you want to quit, there's the door. But while I'm chief, we're going to do what's right, not what's easy." Just then, her phone buzzed. A text from the station. Her car in the parking lot had been vandalized. All 4 tires slashed, but scratched. She kept her face neutral as she slipped the phone back into her pocket. "One more thing," she added, "to whoever's behind the intimidation attempts, the coffee, the vandalism, the threats. You should know that every incident is being documented. I may be new as chief, but I've been a detective for 15 years. Eventually, I will find out who's responsible." The mood in the room shifted subtly. A few officers looked away, guilt flickering across their faces. Others sat straighter, as if seeing their chief in a new light. As the meeting ended, a small group of officers lingered behind. The youngest stepped forward. Chief, not all of us agree with the union. Some of us. Some of us became cops to help people. We want to be part of the change. Walking back to her car later, Wong noticed the slashed tires and scratched paint. But she also noticed something else. 3 officers from the meeting were already there, changing her tires, their own time, their own expense. No words were exchanged, just quiet nods of support. That evening, as she finally headed home, Wong thought about power. Not the kind that comes from a badge or a title, but the kind that comes from doing what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she knew she wasn't fighting it alone. Hope often comes from unexpected places. As Chief Wong sat in her office reviewing the day's reports, a knock on her door revealed Officer Rodriguez, one of the department's younger members. His usual confident smile was replaced with a look of determination. "Chief, I think you need to see this," he said, placing his body camera on her desk. "It's from my patrol of Pine Grove today." The footage showed something remarkable. Instead of just driving through the neighborhood, Rodriguez had parked his car and walked the streets. He stopped to play basketball with some kids, chatted with shop owners, and helped an elderly man carry his groceries. What struck Wong most was how people's expressions changed, from fear when they first saw his uniform to genuine smiles by the end of each interaction. "I tried it your way," Rodriguez explained. "And Chief, it works. People actually wanted to talk to me. A store owner even told me about some suspicious activity he'd been too scared to report before." Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, 5 more officers had adopted similar approaches. They started sharing stories in the break room about the teenage artist they'd connected with, the former gang member who now helped keep peace in his neighborhood, the grandmother who baked them cookies after they fixed her fence. The real breakthrough came from Officer Thompson, one of the department's most experienced members. She had been skeptical at first, but after a month of community engagement, she organized a town hall meeting. The community center was packed. Residents, business owners, officers, all sitting together, actually talking instead of talking past each other. "I've been on the force for 18 years, Thompson shared with the group, her voice carrying years of experience. "But this past month, I've learned more about our community than in all those years combined." A local pastor stood up. "For years, we were afraid to call the police, even when we needed help. Now, we're starting to see officers as people, as part of our community. It's a small start, but it's something." The changes weren't just emotional. They were showing up in the numbers too. Tips from community members had helped solve 3 major cases in the past month. Complaints against officers had dropped by 40%. Even response times had improved because people were more willing to give officers directions and information. But not everyone was convinced. A core group of resistant officers still clung to old ways. They filed daily complaints, tried to undermine new initiatives, and continued to push back against every change. Yet their voices were growing quieter as success stories mounted. The turning point came during a crisis at the local high school. A student had brought a weapon to campus, and the old protocol would have called for an aggressive response. Instead, Officer Chen, who had built relationships with students through the new community program, was able to talk to the troubled teen. The situation ended peacefully, with the student getting help rather than just handcuffs. That evening, Wong found an unexpected ally in Lieutenant Richards, one of her strongest critics. He came to her office, looking thoughtful. "You know, Chief," he said, sitting down heavily, "I've been doing this job one way for 30 years. Thought it was the only way. But today, watching Chen, that kid could have been another statistic. Instead, he's got a chance now." Word of the incident spread through the department. More officers began signing up for community engagement training. Even some of the old guards started to come around, albeit slowly. They couldn't argue with results. Safer communities, more solved cases, and most importantly, growing trust. The local coffee shop, once a hub of anti-police sentiment, now had a first responders drink-free sign in the window. Kids who used to run from patrol cars now waved at officers they knew by name. Senior citizens started organizing neighborhood walks with officers, sharing stories, and building bridges across generations. One morning, Wong arrived to find her office decorated with thank you cards from community members. But what touched her most was a simple note from Officer Bradford, her former union opponent. "You were right. Sometimes the hardest changes are the most necessary ones." As she pinned the cards to her wall, Wong thought about how change really happens, not through force or fear, but through small acts of courage, one person at a time, one day at a time. The department wasn't perfect yet, but they were building something new, something better, together. Little did she know, their greatest test was still to come. One that would either cement these changes or shatter them completely. The crisis struck on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Chief Wong was reviewing community feedback forms when Officer Thompson burst into her office, face pale with urgency. "Chief, we've got a situation at Oak Street High School," she said, breathing hard. A student was arrested by Officers Clark and Wilson. The video's already going viral. The body camera footage made Wong's heart sink. A young honor student had been roughly handled during an arrest after a misunderstanding in the school cafeteria. The officers had ignored the principal's attempts to explain that the student was having an anxiety attack, not being disruptive. Within hours, the video was everywhere. Angry crowds gathered outside the police station. News vans lined the street. Social media exploded with calls for immediate action. All the trust they'd built over the past months seemed to be crumbling. "You have to suspend those officers immediately," the mayor insisted over the phone. "The public wants blood." But Wong had learned that quick reactions weren't always the best ones. Instead of rushing to judgment, she did something unexpected. She called a meeting. Not just with police officials, but with students, teachers, parents, and community leaders. The school gymnasium was packed. Tension filled the air as Wong took the stage. People expected excuses, defensive statements, the usual bureaucratic response. Instead, they got honesty. "What happened yesterday was wrong," Wong began, her voice clear and steady. "There's no excuse for it. But rather than just tell you what we're going to do, I want to hear from you first. What do you need from us right now?" The room fell silent. Then a student raised her hand. "We need to feel safe at school," she said. "Not afraid that a bad day could end with us in handcuffs." One by one, people stood up and shared their thoughts. A teacher talked about students afraid to come to school. A parent described how her child now had nightmares about police officers. The school counselor explained how this could undo months of progress with students dealing with anxiety. Instead of getting defensive, the officers present listened, really listened. Even Officers Clark and Wilson were there, looking increasingly uncomfortable as they heard the impact of their actions. Then something remarkable happened. Officer Wilson stood up. "I messed up," he said, his voice shaking. "I forgot everything we've learned these past months. I saw a situation and defaulted to force instead of understanding. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I am asking for a chance to make it right." The room grew quiet. A student's grandmother slowly stood up. "Making it right starts with understanding why it was wrong," she said. "Are you willing to learn?" That meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end, a plan had emerged, not one handed down from above, but one created together. The officers would be suspended, yes, but they would also attend intensive training on dealing with mental health crises. They would work with school counselors to understand anxiety and trauma. Most importantly, they would participate in student-led workshops about building trust. The school would implement a new protocol for police interactions, developed with input from students and teachers. Officers assigned to schools would receive special training in adolescent psychology and crisis intervention. But the most powerful change came from the students themselves. They proposed a Bridge the Gap program, regular meetings between students and officers, not just during crisis, but for everyday conversations and understanding. The next day, instead of protests, something different happened. Students and officers sat together in the cafeteria, talking, listening, learning from each other. The two suspended officers were there too, not in uniform, but as people willing to learn and change. A month later, Officer Wilson was back on duty, but different. He'd become one of the most vocal advocates for the new approach. The student from the incident had become an active member of the Bridge the Gap program, turning a painful experience into positive change. Late one evening, as Wong was leaving the office, she noticed something new on the community bulletin board. A photo from that day in the cafeteria, showing officers and students laughing together. Below it, someone had written, "Change happens one conversation at a time." She touched the photo gently, thinking about how close they'd come to losing everything they built. But sometimes, she realized, it takes a crisis to show people what really matters. The department hadn't just survived this test, they'd grown stronger because of it. As she headed home, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the student council president. "Thank you for listening when you could have just acted." That made all the difference. The real test of Chief Wong's leadership came unexpectedly. A string of robberies had hit the downtown area, targeting small businesses. 3 stores in 1 week, all hit during closing time. The pressure to solve these crimes was mounting, and some officers were pushing to return to the old aggressive patrol tactics. "This is exactly why we need to crack down harder," Lieutenant Bradford argued during the morning briefing. "These new community-friendly policies are making us look soft." Wong stood at the front of the room, looking at the concerned faces of her officers. "Actually," she said, pulling up a map on the screen, "this is where our new approach proves its worth." Thanks to the relationships they'd built over the past months, shop owners were no longer hesitant to share information with the police. The owner of a small bakery called Officer Rodriguez directly when she noticed suspicious activity. A teenage skateboarder, who once would have run from the police, told Officer Chen about strange noises he'd heard behind the bookstore late at night. "We've got more eyes and ears on the street than ever before," Wong explained. "People trust us enough to come forward. That's not being soft. That's being smart." She unveiled a new strategy. Instead of flooding the streets with patrol cars, they would work with the community. Shop owners formed a text alert network. The local youth center extended its hours, giving teenagers a safe place to hang out and keeping them away from trouble. Officers spent time getting to know the regular patterns of each neighborhood. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Lee, who ran the corner grocery store, had been noting down license plate numbers of cars that lingered too long after dark. She'd been too scared to report suspicious activity in the past, but now she had Officer Thompson's direct number. "These 2 cars," she said, showing her notebook. "They drive by every night before a robbery, real slow-like. Always the same time." The information led to a stakeout, but not the kind from old police movies. Officers sat in local shops, chatting with owners, becoming part of the everyday scene. Community members kept their eyes open, reporting anything unusual through their new network. On a quiet Thursday evening, it all came together. The suspicious cars appeared, but this time, they found a community ready and waiting. Shop owners discreetly locked their doors. The youth center kids, usually hanging outside, were safely indoors. And when the would-be robbers made their move, they found themselves surrounded, not just by police, but by a neighborhood that stood united. The arrest was peaceful. No shots fired, no high-speed chase, no violence. Just good, solid police work backed by community support. At the station later that night, even the most skeptical officers had to admit, this new approach had worked better than the old ways ever could. "You know what's really different?" Officer Chen remarked during the debriefing. "We didn't just catch some criminals. We helped a community protect itself." The local newspaper ran a story about the arrests, but the real story wasn't about the crimes solved. It was about how a neighborhood had transformed. Shop owners who once barely spoke to each other now had a tight-knit support system. Teenagers who used to fear the police were now part of the solution. Officers who had measured success by arrest numbers were now measuring it by community connections. A week later, the shop owners organized a community dinner to thank the police department. The community center was packed with people from all walks of life. Business owners, residents, officers, and their families, all sharing food and stories. Mrs. Lee stood up to speak, her voice soft but clear. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have called the police if I saw trouble. I was too afraid. Now I know every officer by name. My store isn't just protected by the police, it's protected by our whole community. As Wong looked around the room, she saw something remarkable. Officers weren't standing apart from the crowd, as they once would have. They were sitting with families, laughing with teenagers, playing with children. The uniforms didn't create barriers anymore, they were just part of the community fabric. Later that evening, looking at crime statistics, Wong noticed something interesting. Not only had they solved the robbery case, but overall crime rates had dropped significantly. More importantly, community tips and cooperation had reached an all-time high. This, she thought, is what real police work looks like. Not us versus them, but all of us together, making our community safer, one relationship at a time. 6 months into Chief Wong's leadership, the numbers told a powerful story. Crime rates had dropped by 30%. Civilian complaints against officers were down by 65%. But the most striking statistic wasn't in any official report. It was in the daily life of the community. The same union that had once threatened her position now faced an unexpected situation. During their monthly meeting, Officer Thompson stood up with a surprising announcement. I've been looking at our department's statistics, she said, spreading papers across the table. Our solve rate for serious crimes is up 40%. Emergency response times are faster because people actually give us directions now instead of turning away. And officer morale? We've had the lowest sick leave rates in 10 years. The room buzzed with conversation. These weren't just numbers. They were proof that change was working. That afternoon, a local reporter visited the station for a follow-up story. She found officers in the break room, but they weren't just drinking coffee. They were planning a community basketball tournament, with teams mixing police officers and local teenagers. Last year, these kids would run when they saw us coming. Officer Chen explained, grinning. Now they argue over who gets which officer on their team. The reporter watched as a group of elderly residents brought homemade cookies to the station. A regular Friday tradition that had started spontaneously. They sat with officers, sharing neighborhood news and family stories. One grandmother proudly showed photos of her grandson, recently hired as a police cadet. You know what's different now? She told the reporter. When I see a police car on my street, I don't worry anymore. I wave because I know who's inside. The change was visible everywhere. The old police line, "Do not cross" tape still existed, but now it was mostly seen at community events where officers and residents played together. The stern-faced police photos in the station hallway had been replaced with pictures of officers reading to kindergarten classes, helping at food drives, and teaching bicycle safety to kids. But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source. A former gang member, now working with at-risk youth, requested a meeting with Wong. I've been watching what you're doing, he said quietly. For the first time, I'm seeing kids in my neighborhood talk about becoming police officers. They see themselves in your officers now. That's huge. The mayor's office had noticed too. What started as a controversial appointment had become a model for other departments. Police chiefs from neighboring cities began visiting, taking notes, asking questions about how to implement similar changes. During one such visit, a skeptical chief from a nearby town watched as Officer Rodriguez handled a potential crisis. A heated argument outside a store could have escalated, but instead of rushing in with sirens blazing, Rodriguez walked up calmly, greeted people by name, and had everyone laughing within minutes. That officer knew everyone involved, the visiting chief remarked, surprised. That's the point, Wong explained. We're not just enforcing the law, we're part of the community we serve. The local high school asked to start a police mentorship program. The owner of the coffee shop where officers had once been unwelcome now hosted monthly coffee with a cop meetings. Even the graffiti on the old warehouse wall had changed. Where there were once anti-police messages, there was now a beautiful mural, created by local artists working alongside officers. Late one evening, Wong found a letter on her desk. It was from Officer Bradford, once her strongest opponent. I need to admit something, he wrote. I fought against these changes because I was afraid. Afraid that treating people with more kindness meant being less effective as police officers. The station itself felt different. The harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with warmer ones. The bare walls now displayed community artwork. The front desk, once protected by thick glass, was now open and welcoming. Even the coffee was better. Local shops took turns providing fresh brew each week. As Wong looked out her office window at officers chatting with residents in the parking lot, she realized something profound. They hadn't just changed policies. They'd changed the entire culture of policing in their town. And that change was beginning to ripple out far beyond their city limits. Yet even as she celebrated these victories, Wong knew that maintaining this progress would require constant vigilance and commitment. The real test would be ensuring these changes lasted beyond her leadership, becoming not just a temporary success story, but a permanent transformation in how police and communities work together. 1 year after Chief Wong took office, national news crews gathered outside the Millbrook Police Department. The department had become a symbol of successful police reform, but the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the small, everyday moments that had transformed a community. That morning, Wong walked into the station and stopped, surprised. The normally busy lobby was empty except for Officer Chen at the front desk, wearing a suspicious smile. Everyone's out back, Chief, he said, trying to hide his grin. As she walked through the building, she noticed something odd. All the officers, staff, and even regular visitors seemed to have disappeared. When she pushed open the back door, she understood why. The parking lot had been transformed. Hundreds of people, officers, community members, shop owners, students, and families, stood together. A huge banner read, "1 year of change, a lifetime of trust." The elderly Mrs. Lee, who once kept her store shuttered in fear, now stood proudly next to Officer Thompson. The teenage skateboarders who used to scatter at the sight of police were teaching Officer Rodriguez new tricks. The former gang member who'd become a youth mentor was deep in conversation with the mayor. "We have something to show you," Officer Bradford said, leading Wong to a covered wall. When they pulled back the sheet, Wong's eyes filled with tears. It was a massive photo collection. Hundreds of pictures showing the transformation of their department. The first row showed the early days. Tense community meetings, protest signs, angry faces. But as the images progressed, everything changed. There were photos of officers playing basketball with kids, helping elderly residents with groceries, teaching bike safety classes. Pictures of community dinners, youth mentorship programs, and joint police community projects. Each image told a story of barriers breaking down and trust building up. But that's not all, Bradford said, his voice thick with emotion. We've got some people who want to share something. One by one, community members stepped forward. A young student spoke about how an officer had helped him apply to college instead of arresting him for a minor offense. A shop owner described how the police had become friends rather than figures of fear. A former critic of the department shared how he'd changed his mind after seeing officers engage with the community day after day. Then Officer Rodriguez stepped forward with a surprise. He'd been tracking data beyond the usual statistics. "Look at these numbers," he said, pulling out a chart. Emergency response times are down because people guide us to locations instead of avoiding us. Solve rates are up because witnesses come forward willingly. But here's the amazing part. Officer job satisfaction is at an all-time high. The mayor approached the podium, holding an envelope. "Chief Wong," she announced, "your methods have attracted national attention. 5 other cities have already adopted your community engagement model. But today, we're announcing something even bigger." She opened the envelope. "The state has chosen our department to lead a new police training program. Departments from across the country will send officers here to learn our methods. What started in Millbrook will help transform policing nationwide." The crowd erupted in applause, but Wong raised her hand for quiet. "This success isn't mine," she said, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "It belongs to every person here. Every officer who chose to change. Every community member who chose to trust. Every young person who chose to hope." She walked to the photo wall, touching an image of officers and residents working together to plant a community garden. "This is what real change looks like," she continued. "Not just new policies or better statistics, but human connections. We didn't just reform a police department. We rebuilt a community." As if to prove her point, the celebration turned into an impromptu community festival. Officers and residents shared food from local restaurants. Kids taught police officers their latest dance moves. The high school band, which had once played at protests against the police, now performed for everyone. Late that evening, as the crowd thinned, Wong found a small note tucked under her windshield wiper. It was from a rookie officer who joined the force just as she became chief. "Before I became an officer," the note read, "I was taught that police work was about power and control. You showed us it's really about service and connection. Thank you for teaching us that the strongest force in law enforcement isn't force at all. It's trust."